If you ask people to make a list of the most brutal dictators in history, the odds are that Joseph Stalin's name will come up quickly. This has led to plenty of speculation as to what would have happened if he never rose to power. The most common alternative is having Leon Trotsky come to power instead of Stalin. I'm not the first one to take this on, but I find it an interesting thought exercise, so we are going to take it on. We'll look both at what it would have taken for Trotsky to come to power and what he would have done while in power, and what would the outcome of his reign have been. The first question we must answer is, how does Trotsky come to power instead of Stalin? The first thing that we must do is establish once and for all that Lenin's testament is real. The majority opinion of the document is that it is a legitimate document from Lenin, but that has never been established 100%. We're doing that now. This also means that we are establishing the postscript, which is considered more dubious, which recommends Stalin's removal as general secretary to be legitimate. This might seem like something of a stretch, but it would not have been out of character for Lenin to do so. As time passed, Lenin became more and more critical of Stalin, even threatening to cut off contact with Stalin over rudeness of the Georgian to Lenin's wife. Thus, we see that the idea of cutting Stalin out is not so far-fetched. We also must recognize that Stalin was not the only Soviet leader to be criticized in Lenin's testament. Also criticized were Nikolai Bukharin, the editor of Pravda, Grigory Zinoviev, the chairman of the Comintern, Lev Kamenev, the deputy premier, and even Trotsky himself. Zinoviev, Kamenev, and Stalin made up the ruling troika in the aftermath of Lenin's death. However, the criticism of Trotsky was also tempered, as Lenin said that, quote, he is personally perhaps the most capable man in the present CC, but he has displayed excessive self-assurance and shown excessive preoccupation with purely administrative side of the work. It would certainly sound as though while Lenin was not completely sold on Trotsky's ability to lead, was more persuaded of him than some of his potential rivals. This was not to be, however. It was Lenin's purported desire that the letter be read before the 12th Politburo in April of 1923. However, once Lenin suffered a stroke that rendered him incapable of speech, his wife, Nadezhda Krupskaya, decided to hide it, hoping instead that her husband would recover. He never did, and the document did not come to light until after his death. In our alternate timeline, we will assume one of two things. Either A, Krupskaya fulfills her husband's wishes to make the document known, or B, the stroke is not quite as devastating to Lenin as it was in our timeline, so that he is at least still able to speak and insist that the testament be read to the Politburo. This would be a major blow to Stalin, but I'm not sure that by itself is enough to swing things Trotsky's way. Instead, we're going to assume that the more capable Lenin makes it clear before his death that not only is Stalin to be removed from his position, but that Trotsky is to be the successor. With Lenin on record, I see preparations being made before his death to allow for Trotsky's succession, which will ensure his position. Let us not make the mistake that Trotsky idealists make and assume that there would be no purge. I can accept the idea that the purges might not have been as intense under Trotsky, especially in things like the military, but Trotsky would have ridded himself of anyone that was a potential threat, and that would have included Stalin. I'm not saying that Stalin would have received an ice pick to the head, but he would have at least been banished. Perhaps it would be Stalin in Mexico saying, quote, well, I would have done it differently. In addition to banishing Stalin, I believe Trotsky would have gotten rid of the position of General Secretary of the party as well to prevent having anyone consolidate enough power to challenge him as the premier. Trotsky would have taken this position instead of Alexei Rykov, who would still be chairman of the People's Commissar for the RSFSR. As I said, I don't see as big of a purge in the military, and that's because Trotsky as a military commander was well loved in the demographic. Trotsky would have treated the military well and put it to use. I admit to have struggled with the question of whether a Trotsky in power would be as much of a swashbuckler as he talked or would have been more pragmatic, falling more into the Stalin mode of advancing socialism within the nation. Trotsky's belief in permanent revolution would see the fires of revolution stoked repeatedly, both within the Soviet Union and in other places. This spread would have first been attempted in regions of the former Russian Empire that gained independence after the fall of the Romanovs. The Baltics would likely have been the first place that would have seen invasions. The outcomes would have been different this time than they were when the Russians were not dealing with their own civil war. The active Russian army was 10 times the size of the combined armies of the 3 Baltic nations. Of course, the Baltics would have called up reservists, but the Russian army would have continued to expand as well. Trotsky was interested in growing the army when he was not the man in charge of the entire nation, and it would have been his #1 priority once he gained leadership. The 3 tiny nations would have been bulldozed in no time, as the successor state to the empire reclaimed that lost land. This would have been a matter of weeks. It still would have been relatively early in 1924 when the Baltic states were annexed. Finland and Poland are the obvious next targets. There are reasons for going after each of them. Finland's advantage is protecting Leningrad. Poland's advantage is opening a border to Germany, from which would provide a greater opportunity to foment revolution in Germany. Ultimately, though, while I do feel that Germany would be high on Trotsky's target list, making sure that things were settled on the home front would have to take priority. There's no spreading socialism if socialism fails in Russia, so Finland it is. One would have to think that the Finns would be on alert after the Baltics fell, but Trotsky will not make the mistake that the Soviets made in 1939 by invading in the winter. The quick collapse of the Baltics will allow for a summertime attack on Finland. The Finns would have put up a stronger resistance than the Baltics, as the terrain and, well, what we saw in 1939 and 1940 in our timeline would appear, but a more favorable time of year for the invasion, as well as internal resistance to military spending in Finland, would doom the defense. Socialist factions sometimes lobbied for the demobilization of the White Guards. The Socialists would fight to overthrow the Finnish government, siding with the Soviets. Trotsky, initially looking to reclaim Finland, rather than setting up an independent socialist Finland, would at first annex the nation. This would lead to guerrilla tactics continuing after the invasion, and in a moment of pragmatism, I believe that Trotsky would pivot and allow a Finnish satellite state under the leadership of Kullervo Manner, who would return to Finland from his Soviet exile. This would take a bit of time, but it would satisfy the Finnish socialists and allow Trotsky to claim a success. I'm going to assume that we are into 1926 when the invasion of Poland starts. There'd be protests to accompany the invasion of the Baltics, though the world would little care to start a fight over such a small, newly independent nations. The Finland invasion would cause the League of Nations to formally protest. Poland would increase the alarm, and the League would vote to condemn the actions of the Soviet Union, though the Soviets would care little about the condemnation as non-aspirant non-members. This would lead to Germany joining the League slightly earlier in 1926, as they would argue that their membership was necessary for protection against Soviet aggression. While their petition for membership would be heard and granted, their request for action against the Soviets would fall on deaf ears, other than a few nearby nations fearing a similar fate. Czechoslovakia and Romania would come to the aid of the Poles, which would slow down the invasion. The war with Poland would be dragged out quite a bit due to the aid they received from their neighbors, but the outcome would be inevitable. The going would be slower than in Finland, and I think that Poland, with aid, would last until about 1929. There would be a partitioning of Poland. Trotsky, not wanting to repeat the problem with guerrillas in Finland, would leave a Polish rump state as a puppet, while annexing some land to Belarus, Lithuania, and Ukraine in the east. The rump state would be left under the control of Edward Prochniak, who in our timeline was arrested by the NKVD and executed as part of Stalin's purge. Before we continue down the road of Trotsky's attempt at world revolution, we'll use the mention of the purge as a pivot to domestic issues under Trotsky. First, there's the question of whether there would be a purge or not. I think that the answer is yes. The difference is that it might not have been as extreme, as I see no reason to think that Trotsky was as paranoid as Stalin was. Even so, rivals would have to be dealt with, and loyalty to the revolution would be a must. As with Stalin, anyone who was too vocal in their criticism of Trotsky would have to watch their back. Additionally, anyone that was too critical of the military and its use in spreading revolution would be in danger. Another frequently wondered about scenario is whether the Holodomor would still be a thing. Again, I think the answer is yes, but also again, I think that it would have looked somewhat different. Collectivization would still have happened. The resulting famine also would have still happened. However, I don't think that it would have been weaponized in the same way under Trotsky that I believe it was under Stalin. In other words, people would still starve, but would not be targeted starvation for political purposes. This is both because I do not think it would have been Trotsky's style to do this, and because of his connections to Ukraine. He would not have desired to see that kind of ruin come to his homeland. One thing from Stalin's regime that I think would be missing from Trotsky's would be the anti-Semitism, largely because Trotsky himself was a Jew. Ironically, this would mean no creation of the Jewish Autonomous Oblast, because Trotsky would not try to force Jews into the Far East. Rather, they would be allowed to continue to live across the nation. In a similar vein, I don't see mass ethnic deportations happening under Trotsky. The ethnic groups that were deported to Siberia in our timeline would be allowed to stay in their native lands. The fact that things like these would be lighter or non-existent under Trotsky should not be taken to mean that the Soviet Union would be an easy place to live under Trotsky. There would still be some sort of purge, and thus there would still be terror. There would still be a focus on heavy industry, as Trotsky, like Stalin, would have seen it necessary to modernize the nation. It would have been essential to his military goals as well. Similarly to our timeline, that would have seen consumer production lag, meaning that there would be a cap to the level of quality life that could be expected by the average person. Transitioning back to the spread of socialism, I think that Trotsky would change tactics a bit after Poland. It would not be a direct invasion of Germany immediately. This is because with the escalating tensions, an invasion of Germany would very clearly start a wider war, and it's not clear that the Russians could win. There would be resources poured in to help the German socialists, and the Russians would try to make Germany fall from the inside. The terms of peace after World War I would make things difficult on Germany, to say the least. They would have limited forces to deal with uprisings, and the early 1930s would be a chaotic time in Germany. There would be an uneasy alliance between the nationalists and the government under Paul von Hindenburg. An interesting consequence that I see is that this just might prevent Adolf Hitler from coming to power. The nationalists would be too busy fighting against the Russian-backed socialists, and thus would not be able to try to weasel their way into power, but would reluctantly support Hindenburg. Meanwhile, the socialists would not be ripe for co-opting into the Nazi party because they would be fighting for the control of the state themselves. The lowbrow usage of socialist talking points by the nationalists would be ineffective when the socialists themselves were on the verge of taking control, and thus claiming to set up their utopia alone. Without the Soviets moving into Germany but fighting by proxy, I believe that these things would stalemate for a while. Since the Soviet army is not directly involved, it would solve some problems with the war wariness among the population, which is something that Trotsky would have ignored, much to his own peril. The reprieve that the population would get would relieve some anger that would have been building up. Trotsky loved the army much in the way that Napoleon did. I believe both cared about the men that were involved, as they were committed to fighting for a purpose that their leaders laid out, but both felt that the army was there to be used. This is fine for those in the military, as they receive all the perks of a leader who cares about his military. For those at home, however, it looks like their men being constantly put into danger. The stalemate in Germany would have lasted until 1934 when Hindenburg died. That would destabilize the government forces in Germany. Without a real figurehead that everyone could get behind, the German government would soon fall. This would be alarming to the Western European powers, who would all fear that they were next, and a coalition would be formed to defend against Soviet aggression. The League of Nations would collapse earlier in this timeline. If it was demonstrated to be impotent in our timeline, it looks even more so in this timeline. Such a blitz was not supposed to be possible in the post-Great War world, and the nations that felt that they were possibly next would decide that they could do better outside of the League. I believe that the coalition would be enough to stop the forced spread of socialism into the West. There would be a Red Scare in Western Europe, and anyone who was even suspected of association with the Soviets would be dealt with in any way allowed by law, possibly even stretching the bounds of constitutional means at the time. Ironically, I don't think that Trotsky would fall from the outside in this scenario. The fact that there would not be a purge on the level of what Stalin did, and the fact that he was so focused on the spread of communism rather than securing things on the home front would be his undoing. Those jealous of his position and desiring powers for themselves would conspire together to assassinate Trotsky. Perhaps he should have been more paranoid like Stalin was in our timeline. This will cause things to unravel. There would be no set structure to replace Trotsky, and those that once worked together to eliminate him would then turn on each other, trying to claim their place at the top of the food chain. This would mean that Russia, not much more than a decade out of one civil war, would find themselves in another. The new formed coalition would immediately enter Germany, unraveling the last thing that Trotsky accomplished before his death, before turning their attention to his earlier work. The liberation of Eastern Europe would be on, and there would be an advance into Russia proper as well. Ultimately, I think this civil war is where the scenario must end. For one thing, it's impossible to determine how many factions there would be involved and who would oversee them. If one thing is certain, nothing with Russia is ever simple, and it would not be a two-faction war. Consider the Russian Civil War in our timeline. There were the Reds, the Whites, the Greens, and foreign nation factions involved as well. Before closing this scenario, however, let's look at some of the differences that would take place in the rest of the world. First, if there's no Hitler, that means that the history of Europe comes out very different than in our timeline. It would also mean a difference in World War II. I think there would still be something resembling a Second World War, but it would be focused on the Pacific. Japan's ambitions would not go away with the collapse of the Soviet Union. If anything, it might embolden the Japanese because there would be one less power in the area that could potentially interfere. The United States, the British, and the Dutch, for a few, would still be involved in the conflict because of the territories that they held in the Pacific region. This version of the war would be much shorter. Once the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor and brought the United States into the war, the full fury of the Americans would be unleashed on the Japanese, as there's no German declaration of war against the United States to split the nation's attention. I see this war ending by 1943, though it has a much uglier ending than in our timeline. As awful and destructive as the aftermath of the atomic bombs were in this timeline, the time to take on the Japanese homeland comes before those weapons are invented, and there is a necessity for a full-force invasion of the Japanese home islands. This would not only mean a large death toll among military forces, but also among the Japanese population. Cities would be ravaged by bombs and combat, killing many, while starvation would set in because of the lack of resources and infrastructure remaining, leading to the deaths of many more. I won't speculate on what sort of death toll that there would be in such an invasion, other than guessing that it would be well into the 7 figures. Is this scenario better or worse than what happened in our real-life timeline? I think that all depends on where you're from and what your perspective is. Maybe Trotsky would not have been as brutal domestically as Stalin was, but what are the effects of a second civil war? Germany gets ravaged by fighting once again. Western Europe gets saved from the terror of World War II, but Japan takes things much worse. I don't know that we can say that really one outcome is better or worse than the other. Either way, we see the horror that human nature and war can exact on our world.